joining us. My name is Kim Walker. I'm with the National Alliance to End Homelessness. And today we're doing a webinar on coordinated assessment and system change. We're very lucky to have with us Suzanne Wagner from Housing Innovations, LLC, and Matt White with Abt Associates, who both have a great deal with coordinated assessment, a great deal of experience with coordinated assessment, as well as a bunch of other topics related to homelessness and housing. I want to give just a couple of the usual reminders about our webinars. This is going to be a 1-hour webinar today, so we'll be ending right around 2 o'clock. We may go a few minutes over if there are a lot of questions. All of the participants today are muted just because of the high number of people on the call. The webinar today will be recorded and posted to our website and specifically to the Coordinated Assessment Toolkit. And I'll be sending out a link, all registered with your email addresses. I'll be sending out a link to you all with where exactly it's been posted, both the webinar and the slides. And I'll also send out a link to the Coordinated Assessment Toolkit in general so you can kind of look through those materials. Audience questions today we'll be taking at the end of today's session. If you do have a question, there should be a box at the bottom of your webinar panel titled either chat or questions where you can type those in. Feel free to enter your questions kind of throughout the webinar. We'll get to them at the very end, but you can start asking them whenever you'd like. I also want to talk a little bit about the structure of today's webinar. Unlike some of the webinars we've done in the past, this webinar is going to be much more discussion-based. So Matt, Suzanne, and I will kind of be talking through some of the common questions we've gotten from people around coordinated assessment. It's going to be a lot less about what's on the actual slides. So it'll be more important today to listen than to read the slides. I do want to start with just kind of an overview to make sure we're all on the same page. So today's webinar is about coordinated assessments, and I want to talk about what we mean when we use that term. Again, today we're not going to dive into kind of the basic concepts or the different models. We do have a lot of information on that on our website, and I know that HUD and USICH and some of our other partners do as well. Today's webinar is going to kind of try to get beyond that a little bit into some more advanced issues. But when we talk about the term coordinated assessment, what we're talking about is a system-wide process that coordinates assessment, referrals, data collection, and intake for people experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness. It's meant to make accessing and receiving services easier for the consumer or the person experiencing homelessness and ensure that they're getting resources that are tailored to their needs. And I know in the past presentations with Matt where we've kind of talked about what coordinated assessment really means, and I think something that both of us have said quite often is that it's really about making a system that's there to serve the consumer. It's not driven by what programs do or what they want to do. It's really driven by what the consumer needs, and I think that's a big part of the concept. Beyond kind of that definition, though, coordinated assessment is kind of more than the sum of its parts. If you do it well, it can increase collaboration between programs, create a more efficient system that can serve people more quickly and has more of the resources that people need, and serve as a starting point for creating larger systems change. And I think a lot of communities are finding that now, that coordinated assessment has kind of started a process for them where we're seeing all these other things kind of fall into place. To get to this point where you're seeing kind of the systems change and to reap the benefits of coordinated assessment, or at least the intended benefits, a lot of communities are having to come up with some solutions to some kind of difficult issues and some more advanced issues going beyond kind of the model they've chosen and the assessment tool that they've chosen. And those kind of issues and kind of the bigger picture concepts behind coordinated assessment are what we're going to focus on today. So we're going to start with, I've divided this into some basic topics. So we're going to start with getting started. And what I want to do here is just kind of introduce some questions and get Suzanne and Matt's feedback and jump on here as well. So what I wanted to start with was oversight. So something that comes up a lot for communities is who's going to be doing this work in the first place and who's going to be responsible for planning and monitoring the coordinated assessment process. So Suzanne and Matt, could you offer some feedback on what you've seen in communities in terms of who's taking the lead on this kind of work?
Well, I'll just jump in and start. I mean, I think the obvious starting point in most communities is the continuum of care lead entity. If nothing else than just to initiate conversations and to sort of facilitate the discussion among some of the key players. But I think you know, it can't just be a continuum of care specific. I mean, it often is, but I think it's more successful when the continuum of care lead entity reaches beyond the sort of typical homeless assistance providers and looks at how the homeless system is interacting with some of the other key players throughout the community, and specifically the faith community, public housing, you know, mainstream systems like the Public Housing Authority, the business community. I think everyone has some interest in a more efficient, more coordinated, more effective system. And so to start with the continuum planning body or lead agency or entity itself is probably the you know, the most logical place for most communities. But to expand beyond that and include others in some of the planning and decision making, I think is probably a strong approach.
I would agree, and I would think I've seen a lot of communities too use kind of a special subcommittee of their lead agency or their COC board or kind of that governing body to take on this work specifically, since it becomes such a big topic to work on. And those kinds of subcommittees I've seen include some of the partners you named. It may be faith-based partners, business partners, local government, but I think those kinds of groups tend to include or kind of need to include more people than just those, especially in the COC certainly, but even beyond homeless assistance.
I just want to add up, you know, everything that Matt and Kim just said, and just about the major funders. In a lot of communities, there are other funders involved in the homeless system, and engaging those other funders in the oversight body, and they may be the ones who are actually making the policies or endorsing the policies and monitoring the process, or part of that work group that we're talking about, which most communities are building coordinated access work group. But I think bringing the various funders to the table has really helped. And in some communities, we've seen the development of sort of an interagency oversight body. In some communities, they've designated, if there are multiple government funders involved, one government agency as the lead monitor to really make sure that the process is working as it's designed, and also to adjust and evaluate and adjust it as needed.
That's a great point. And I think that point about funders actually segues really well into the second question I had up here about buy-in, which is how communities can get buy-in from providers to participate in coordinated assessment in the first place, and particularly those where they're not receiving HUD funding or local funding that's going to require them to participate. And I think, Suzanne, what you said about funders can be a key part of that, especially funders that fund faith-based organizations or other places like that. Educating them about coordinated assessment and what it's meant to accomplish can play a big role in that. And I don't know if you two had some other ideas there as well.
I think that buy-in, we've been seeing some really great buy-in from non-HUD funded providers, because I think of a couple things that coordinated access can make happen for those agencies, which is that they, through this coordinated access process, might have more options for their clients and or the people that they're serving, and most people are interested in expanding the range of referrals they can make for people, and with a coordinated access system, that's often possible and is a real selling point. And I think the other big selling point has been, in terms of assessment, is thinking about assessment is that whatever the standardized assessment tools are that communities are developing, that these are minimum assessment fields that everyone's going to gather, and that we'll all have a shared set of information. And that's been helpful and a way to present it to people that they can participate in this process of a shared assessment, include and still ask the things that they need to ask for their own agency, but that everyone's buying into agreeing on a minimum data set that everyone's going to be collecting, and that's been pretty successful.
I think certainly the focus on benefits and looking at the shared assessment is the right place to start. But there are probably lots of communities where there are not HUD-funded providers who are really reluctant and just very reticent about making changes to their program protocols or the way they operate. And I think it's okay for some communities to start coordinated assessment with maybe a smaller subset of providers, pilot some of the changes that are being designed, and then expand them to the non-HUD-funded providers as they start to understand the benefits and as the CSC starts to experience some of the efficiencies of that system. A kind of phased approach or a pilot approach is absolutely, I think, the right way to go for some communities where there's just lots of sort of like, heel digging and reticence about jumping on the bandwagon.
So that's kind of letting the results speak for themselves, I guess, there. And I think a lot of communities have actually that have started down this path have done just what you said, and that have started with kind of a small group, maybe only their family emergency shelter providers or their family system, and the providers that are receiving that HUD funding, and then again kind of hoping to expand from there. And one thing I wanted to add, too, that I think communities should consider is getting feedback from consumers themselves. I know we've heard from a few communities that have done consumer focus groups or surveys, for example, and they've asked consumers about their ability to access services and what would have made that easier. And then in that context, it's really coming out that, of course, it would be easier for a consumer to go to one place and not have to make 6 to 10 phone calls every day or every week to try to find those services. And I think bringing providers back and helping them remember what this is all supposed to be for and what kind of the role of the homeless assistance system is can be really powerful for some people in kind of considering whether to participate or not.
Exactly. Another thing that I want to add that I've seen in a couple of communities, oftentimes the non-HUD-funded providers tend to be your rescue missions. Oftentimes they're the kind of shelter operators, the emergency crisis or just shelter bed operators. And in some communities, what they've done is they've started their coordinated assessment process at the other end of the continuum, of the other end of the service spectrum, organizing and coordinating access to their permanent supportive housing supply, and then creating some expectations or standards for their community that the only way to access those resources is for the clients who have been assessed or entered through the coordinated assessment process. So it becomes a real benefit for a lot of these shelters and missions to participate because they see PSH as a resource for their clients that they want to be able to move them into. So that may be, in some instances, another option that communities might want to pursue is starting your coordinated assessment process from the back end as a kind of an access point for your supportive housing, and then creating incentives for the shelter and other operators to participate as a way to refer clients.
That's a great idea. I am going to move us forward one more topic into eligibility requirements. And what we want to talk about here is the requirements that individual programs may have regarding who they admit or who they serve. Typically, from what we've seen, these are around things like employment status, sobriety or substance use, criminal record, etc. So it may just be whatever requirements you have for someone to successfully enter your program. What we've found when we're looking at these kind of across homeless assistance systems in a lot of places is that those requirements, when added up, can screen out people, and in particular, some of the hardest to serve households. So at a system level, programs may not realize that their requirements are contributing to something where a lot of the people that are coming for assistance, almost no one or maybe one program will take them. That program is full, and those people may end up going unserved or living on the street. So I think something, at least that I've experienced when I've worked with communities on coordinated assessment, is that they kind of run into this obstacle somewhere around the time they're working on assessment tools or referrals, and it can be really difficult to figure out kind of how to move past that and to create a system that's more inclusive. So I wanted to address some of those questions today. So just to start out, how can programs identify the requirements that they may have that aren't really maybe serving a strong purpose for their program, or requirements that they could do without and still serve people well, or maybe contributing to kind of this system-wide screening out? And Suzanne and Matt, I don't know if you've also encountered this as well, but what are your kind of suggestions for programs and for systems that are kind of taking a look at these sort of requirements?
I think that it's usually a common starting or not first step, but an initial step is in a lot of communities to really identify what are the requirements by the different program types for getting into the programs, and really starting to look at which ones of these required or a mandate of the funding. You know, this requires the person be homeless, this requires maybe diagnostic information, and then really separating out which ones have just been added that aren't necessarily tied to the funding, so that they have a sense of what they're talking about. Which are these requirements that may be agency-based or they may be system-based, but aren't necessarily related to the funding source. And I think one of the surprises has been sometimes that people think have thought these were funder requirements, and they really weren't. They're kind of like vestigial organs that somehow became tied to the programs and aren't necessarily required as a condition of the funding. So I think really taking a look at what those things are has been really helpful as a community in those work groups, helpful to communities to start to figure out what's the target, what requirements do we really need to look at. And then further to really think about, well, if we're looking at the hard outcomes and those standards that we're all trying to achieve as a community, how are these requirements getting in the way of us moving people from shelters or moving people from homelessness, because we have no programs in a community that will actually serve a particular cohort of people or people who have certain issues that we're serving, and people then starting to think about whether they can relax some of those requirements. And I think safety is often one of the concerns that people have, and mission. And I think both of those things need to be addressed if people are relaxing their requirements, in terms of ensuring that there's maybe a behavioral focus, and you know, someone may be using and they can be a behavior problem or can be safety risks, but also they may be using drugs and alcohol and not be a safety risk. So really focusing maybe a little bit more on some of the behaviors that are the problem as opposed to what's causing that behavior. And I just want to bring up the mission thing, because I think the other thing that has been helpful to communities is to really bring their boards on board. It sounds kind of silly, but so that they're aware of the changes that are going on with Forest and what our expectations are, and with the coordinated access on what we're trying to do, and for them to, in order to change missions, a requirement around employment or so on, board of directors often needs to be involved, and they're often not really briefed as deeply as we all are on some of the changes. So that's also been helpful in terms of making some changes in those things.
And I think one thing I was thinking about adding there too is I think the funder thing is a huge one, and I think what can be helpful for programs is to just, and I think this often has to be initiated by that group that's leading the coordinated assessment planning process, is asking programs to write out all of the current eligibility criteria they have. And I've actually heard from some communities that when programs do that, they realize that, you know, they write out everything, and then, you know, that community will send them a person as a referral, and they're like, oh, but we also have this requirement that I didn't think about. And when they're kind of looking at that list of requirements and they've written them all out and they realize kind of who they're screening out, it's kind of surprising to some of them, actually. I think for a lot of programs, they kind of have an understanding internally of who they accept and why, but they don't really always have those kind of written criteria all the time. And I think when they're kind of forced to do that exercise, it really helps them to understand who they're serving and why. And I also think a really great thing to do is for some of those requirements, really questioning, okay, why do we have that requirement if it's not tied to a funder's requirement, for example? And do we have any data that shows or evidence that shows that we can't serve these people or that we don't serve them well? So I think a lot of us, it's easy to think about, particular incidents or households where things didn't work out. But I think using the data to guide you on that is really important.
And I think what we're talking about is through this process of gathering and collecting all of these eligibility criteria and creating kind of these inventories of different practices, being very open and transparent and sharing this information broadly. Oftentimes that's in fact all you need to do is when you sort of draft down or write down all of the eligibility criteria and then share them openly across your continuum of care, programs will, in my experience, often immediately jump to being much more accommodating and say, well, we have it written down that you have to have income in order to get into our program, but we'll make exceptions. Or, we don't want children over the age of 16, but on an ad hoc basis, we might reconsider that. So they oftentimes have a more difficult time defending eligibility criteria when they're written down and made available in a very public and transparent way across the continuum. And so I think that's a really good technique, is just to document everything and share it.
Right, absolutely. And I do want to say, I think our intention here is not to say that it's bad to have eligibility criteria. Obviously, everyone does, and certainly programs develop them with good intentions because they want to protect the people in their program, or they want to make sure that their staff are equipped to serve who's coming in. But again, I think the important thing here is to keep that system lens in mind. And communities may not realize right now that there are this kind of group of people that nobody's serving or very few people are serving. And then with that information, like you're saying, that people may kind of open up their programs and say, well, that wasn't our intention, or maybe we can change X, Y, or Z and better accommodate that population. But I think you're right. I think that kind of transparency is one of the most important first steps to make here and kind of writing those things out. So I'm going to move to kind of another piece of this, which is how can the homeless assistance system leadership kind of incentivize providers to change or drop certain requirements and kind of support them? Because as we've talked about, this can be a change for a program. It may be that, they are able to be flexible on some things but not others, and they may be being asked to change things that maybe they're not as comfortable with. And so I think it's important that there's kind of these supports built in to help programs, make these shifts to doing things a little bit differently. I don't know if you all had any thoughts on kind of the things that you can do to support providers as they're making these changes.
I think it's difficult, and anytime you're talking about, coordinated assessment, you're really talking about systems change, which can be a challenging, difficult process. And I think agencies oftentimes have a difficult time making that transition from thinking about, is this client right for my program, and turning that around and thinking about, well, what is the right intervention or the right program or the right service for this particular client? And I've experienced, and I know that Suzanne can talk to this because I know that she's experienced success with this as well. When you change the conversation in the community, and when a provider or an agency has a set of maybe criteria, when you ask them, okay, well, they might not be right for your particular program, but help us as a system figure out where this client should go. So we're still inviting you to be part of the conversation about finding a solution for this particular client. So, and engaging them in a solution-oriented way gets them, it changes the focus of the conversation in that same way when you're sort of introducing the topic from a program-specific conversation to a client-centered conversation. And I think that's one way to help agencies and providers make that shift. And so it gives them some flexibility to say, you know what, this particular client or this set of characteristics isn't going to be a good fit for our program or the types of services that we offer. But let's as a community have a conversation about where this client should go, or where this particular subpopulation or these characteristics should be served. And I'm going to participate in that conversation and help to find a solution, even if it means that my program isn't ultimately where the client ends up. I want to make sure that they ultimately find some kind of resolution to their housing crisis.
Yep, what Matt's talking about was definitely experienced, and we've done that work together in some communities when people are really thinking about, well, where is this person going to go in the system, and realizing there is no place because they don't meet the eligibility requirements anywhere. I think, most people are mission-driven and want to come up with a solution, and that may make them take a risk on someone. And I think in the communities that have been successful in doing that, they're providing support to those organizations in maybe changing their practice through training, through case conferencing, through consultation, program development assistance, so that they can really feel equipped to serve people, and like they also have are taking advantage of the latest practice and evidence-based practices that are out there. And I think especially when we talk about the crisis response part of the system, they haven't always been a part of all the training and all the new practice and getting a lot of support around changing that practice. So that's been really helpful in helping people think about serving folks that they might not have felt equipped to. And I think the other thing is having some kind of a fail-safe, which if that doesn't really work out, and if it isn't working with the person, that the system will respond to that and take another look and try to figure out what is the best place for that individual, so that a provider doesn't feel like they're stuck. Well, okay, if I take a risk with this person and it doesn't work out, then what? Well, if the system can respond, that can really help. And I think just sort of the other side, some communities we've seen have been doing bonus points to organizations in their funding cycles and their RFPs to incentivize them to work with new populations or different populations, and incentivizing that in their funding process.
And I would say that's a great point, Suzanne. And I think something else we've seen kind of along those lines is communities kind of willing to adjust kind of their outcome expectations, at least to start out, to see if that's even necessary for those providers that are willing to kind of work with higher barrier or what are considered higher risk clients, and then kind of saying, that we know this is new for you and we have these outcome measures, but let's look at, maybe stepping back a bit and trying to start kind of here and then see how things go. And I think another thing that's kind of maybe a little bit of a harder incentive, but a lot of communities I know, or several, have said, as part of the contracting process with some providers that are receiving those local or HUD funds, that they are actually saying to them, you cannot have additional criteria in addition to what we're kind of asking at the assessment point. And I think that can be a very hard change for people, and I don't know if that always works, but in some communities they've just kind of started with that approach, and it's worked for them. So I think there are kind of things kind of along the spectrum of, supporting people, and I think no matter what approach you try, you have to provide support to providers and incentives to make changes, but I think you have everything from kind of contractually requiring it down to, providing education. And I think what you all said about really making it a systems level discussion and talking about if it doesn't work here, where else does it work, and pulling people in that way is really important as well. So I want to move to our next topic, which is waitlist management, which I know a lot of communities, at least that I've spoken to, have struggled with. Kind of figuring out what they need to be doing or what happens if they bring together all of their programs into this one kind of assessment point. So I know some of the questions here have been about, if we've had individual wait lists, do we keep those or not? Some have been, how do we get rid of wait lists? And so I really think this is something worth kind of diving into. So I wanted to kind of start with the initial decisions about having wait lists. So for those communities that do have providers that have their individual wait lists and are moving towards coordinated assessment, how are they kind of weighing whether or not to keep those wait lists or not? And in general, for communities that maybe have had a coordinated assessment for a little while now and have wait lists building up for different interventions, which communities have kind of decided to keep those and why, and kind of why have other communities not kept a wait list? And I would love to hear kind of the thoughts from you two on kind of how you think wait lists can or should work, or whether people should have them or not.
It's interesting, and it's a lot of the communities where I work, there's been a lot of resistance to creating wait lists, which I find fascinating. And I guess there's, sort of from the advocacy standpoint, people are, approach this as these are, we're dealing with people who are in crisis, and to put them on a waiting list for some type of housing resolution just doesn't seem to sit well with them. And I totally get that. I understand that. But I think the reality is, in most communities, there aren't enough resources. There aren't enough beds or units for all of the people who need them. And so we're already functioning at a point where there's not an intentional management of who should get this limited amount or this fixed number of resources. So introducing the concept of a wait list, I think, has to be introduced at the same time with the concept of how we're prioritizing or how we're managing a fixed amount or a fixed number of resources. So those two need to be, I think, part of the same conversation. And just to sort of acknowledge some off the bat, having a wait list doesn't create more resources. Just because you have a wait list doesn't create more, housing beds or units to move people into. And in fact, having a wait list will often shine a light on where your gaps are or where the need is greatest. And that, I think, can be very threatening for communities because you can't hide from the fact that you have this huge gap or this huge need for, a certain program type or a certain a program that will serve a different population. So I think for those reasons, it makes a lot of sense to give you having a wait list will help the community to begin a more intentional prioritization and to help you understand where it is that the needs are greatest, and then that allows you to have the kind of reprogramming and shifting resources and adjusting your continuing conversation in a more intentional way.
And I think that's, oh, go ahead, Suzanne.
No, I want to echo that. I think that in some communities there are wait lists already, and some there, it seems like a really, especially at the crisis response end of things, a really different concept. But it does help with the prioritization, and I think that's been one of the real pluses for communities. And this gets to having centralized waiting lists as well, of being able to say we have a finite set of resources. Who is in the community should really be at the top of that list, rather than that just being sort of the luck of who shows up on a given day or who happens to be next, because the person who may be next, while they may need the resource, may not be in the greatest need of the resource or the most difficult to house. So that's one of the big advantages to having the wait list, I think, and really being able to prioritize who's getting served. I think at the other end of the system, on the PSH side, permanent supportive housing, with the current waitlist processes, most agencies have either one waitlist for the agency or a building-based waitlist, a waitlist for each building. So from the client's perspective, they have to be on multiple waitlists, and then from the provider's perspective, they have to manage multiple waitlists. So another advantage that's kind of come out of these waitlist conversations is the idea that, well, if we had one community waitlist or maybe a few only, one for families, one for singles, that reduces some of the burden on individual agencies to maintain all those separate waitlists, and also for clients to maintain their names on all these separate waitlists, and then, again, bringing in that option to prioritize people based on those waitlists. So I think there turn out to be a lot of advantages of having a waitlist, but it is it's interesting, as Matt said, it's in some places, in very different places around the country in terms of where folks are at with the wait list.
And I think you two, really great points. I think a lot of it comes down to kind of how you're using that wait list and why it exists. So I know in some places they have a wait list, and a lot of the reason is because of these kind of eligibility requirements, as we've discussed. So it might be that, there are resources available, but they're limited to such a small group that a lot of the people that need that same kind of bed or program can't get in. And then you kind of see people building up on that wait list. You have people not being able to get into resources that are there, but kind of not really. And I think another one is on the shelter side of things, I think it's always important. I think the prioritization thing is really the key to a lot of this. And I think communities that have these really long shelter wait lists, it's important to ask, what does that really mean? So if these people aren't in shelter, where are they? And I think looking at things like shelter diversion, so people that are coming in, helping them find somewhere else to go. If you can do that, that can cut down significantly on wait lists. And, a lot of times you have wait lists going into the months or things like that, I think it kind of stops meaning something when it comes to something like shelter, because that resource 6 months out, things could be totally different for that household. So I think it's really important to have those conversations about why you're maintaining a wait list, what the point of it is. If the reason for that wait list is something other than the need for the resource. And I think in a lot of the places that is the reason, but again, thinking about, are we doing everything we can to divert people on the front end? Are we looking at our eligibility requirements to make sure those aren't kind of keeping people out of programs altogether, or keeping them on kind of a general transitional housing or permanent supportive housing wait list with kind of no hope? So, but I think you both hit it well. I think the prioritization piece of this and really thinking about what that means and making sure that resources are there for the people that are most vulnerable or need it the most is a really important piece of any wait list discussion. And I wanted to kind of hit on kind of going on this theme, wait lists that existed prior to coordinated assessment. What have you all heard communities doing in those situations? Are they kind of allowing providers to hold on to those wait lists and not centralizing them? I know some places I've talked to, they've actually tried to get programs to kind of clean up their wait lists and then kind of create a centralized wait list with whoever was left. So after they've kind of made the calls and seen if they could get in touch with people, then sent the people that are still, really need those services to their coordinated assessment center to start assembling kind of a longer list. Is that similar to what you two have seen?
In my experience, I think, yeah, and maybe Suzanne, you have a different opinion of this. I'd be interested to see what your sense is. But I think it makes much more sense to focus on one centralized core wait list and manage it as a core sort of system function, and do that all at once. And to enable independent housing projects or agencies to maintain their own separate wait lists causes so many overlaps, and it's so inefficient. And it's confusing for clients. It's confusing for case managers to have to navigate all of these different wait lists. In my opinion, I think it makes more sense to have kind of one centralized wait list and manage it as a one consolidated list. And that means that you have to go through, it's not easy, but you have to go through some kind of joint consolidation process where you're bringing all of these client names onto one single list, and then you go through a purging or a recertifying process on a regular basis to make sure that the clients who are kind of on that list are still around, still in need of care, still in need of some kind of intervention, and that there's some level of follow-up. And the other thing I want to say about wait lists is that just because a client is put on a wait list doesn't mean that they don't get some level of service or some attention. There are lots of kinds of interventions that we can provide that are counseling or support or pointing them to resources. So I don't think the wait list means that the client gets nothing. It just means that we have a more intentional, more deliberate process for linking them to the resource, and ultimately a better fit for them, hopefully.
No, I completely agree, Matt, and in the sense that it's more efficient for agencies. I think it's more efficient for clients where there is one wait list for a particular program types, and it's not one wait list for a whole system. It's more textured than that. The wait list for permanent supportive housing or transitional housing or rapid rehousing, although that obviously we want to get people off that wait list as quickly as possible. I think in terms of the mechanics, one of the things that's been helpful in consolidating wait lists is to sort of set a date where agencies will stop adding to their own agency-based wait lists. And that also becomes the start date that the system starts creating the system wait lists. At the same time, as that happens, so that's a point that everybody can set a date, we can put it on everyone's calendars, get going on that, is also then those agencies are purging those wait lists, as Matt talked about, and making contact with everyone, reaching out to everyone to confirm that they're still on the wait list. And if they're not around or they've been housed or some other situation has occurred, that those wait lists are then chunked down. I mean, I've seen a few wait lists in some communities that people have been on for 5, 6, 7 years. And when they do go through the purging process, a lot of those folks aren't there. At the same time, they're not adding new people, so that centralized wait list is being built, and their wait list that is, after they've done the purge, then merges into that centralized wait list, and hopefully a community has set some priorities so that as they're merging their individual agency wait list into the centralized wait list, they know where that person is prioritized. I've also seen it where they've just said, okay, you can't, we're not adding to individual agency wait lists, but when your wait list is exhausted, meaning you've purged and you've housed everyone who's on the list, then you'll start taking from the centralized wait list as a way to make that transition, because it is in some cases, these wait lists are pretty long, and in larger communities, there are quite a number of people that have to be, managed in this process.
And I think a lot of what you said, a lot of it is about communication, right, between the program and the coordinated assessment agency, and kind of the body planning it all about, again, what does the wait list mean? How is it going to be managed? How should people be prioritized for services, which is a huge part of this, really, is figuring out who in our community needs this resource the most. How are we going to make sure that they get access to this resource before someone who doesn't need it as much? And I think a lot of those conversations should kind of start early on in this process, because, like you're saying, a lot of places may have, very, very long wait lists. And at some point, if someone's waiting for something like shelter for 6 months, again, what does that really mean? What are they doing while they're waiting? Do we know if there's other resources that person could access? As Matt pointed out, again, there's a lot of other resources in a lot of our communities that may be homeless assistance resources or may not be, but does it make more sense to try to connect people as they're calling in to those kinds of things rather than adding them to already a very long list? So I think a lot of it seems to come down to being very clear about what we as a community prioritize and what our expectations are moving forward of something like a centralized wait list. I'm going to go ahead and move us forward just a little bit so we have enough time for audience questions, but I did want to talk about resource allocation. And what we really want to talk about here is the opportunity that's presented with the coordinated assessment process to gather a lot of information in one place or several places in a very standardized format, and what can be done with that. And Matt kind of alluded to earlier with waitlist information, it can really identify gaps in certain places in the system, resources that are needed and aren't there yet. And I think that's one aspect of this. But I think this is a really important thing to think about because, again, I think it poses an excellent opportunity to bring things back to funders and to the system as a whole and get kind of feedback on how the system works and how it's functioning. So I did want to talk about what data that comes out of a coordinated assessment process is needed and could be helpful to communities to make decisions about kind of right-sizing different interventions in their communities. And Matt and Suzanne, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think if you start from just the perspective of the minimum requirement, or what's the HUD sort of baseline expectation for a coordinated assessment, all communities are asked to do is identify and document and track the needs of people through the assessment process. But there's so much value in going beyond that and not just tracking the need or what each client needs based on the assessment that's provided to them and gathering this information, but also looking at what the client gets referred to or what program type you align with that particular need. And then kind of the third step is where the client actually ends up. And I think each one of those things could be different depending on the season, depending on the continuum, depending on the resources and all these different factors. So looking at what a client needs, what you refer them to, which could be a little bit different than their need, and what they ultimately get. And when you align all of those things and kind of map them up, it clearly will point to you and your continuum where your system is more efficient, where there are gaps or inconsistencies, and that informs the resource allocation, the reprogramming, where programs might need to expand or constrict, or all of those kinds of system decisions, I think, can be informed if you track those basic things, the need, what the client should get, and what they actually do get. And then there's other things as well that I'll throw in, but I'll just let Suzanne jump in if she has ideas about other things that should be tracked.
I think all those are really important, and I think it's really helpful to see where the gaps are when you look at those 3 points that Matt was talking about. What did we think the person need? What were they referred to, and what did they get? And it starts to quantify the gaps in the system. And I think then once we're looking also at what they did receive is what are the results of what they did receive? Did that work for them?
Right.
I think one of the things that's been interesting in some of the coordinated access implementations we've worked on is that especially with permanent supportive housing where, turnover is low, and especially in the single side, there are a lot of people who are disabled and really we think that they should be going to permanent supportive housing, and that we've seen that some people can be maintained with other interventions. So I think once we look at what did they get, then we're looking at on how did that work. Were they able to maintain stable housing? Did they return to the shelter or not? What was the gap? Or what was the success? Because I think that's really helped some communities realize in terms of looking at more of a progressive engagement approach. Or I think as a social worker and most of us in the field, we're sort of trying to get the most that we can for people. And I think that's all very well intentioned, but we have limited resources, and I think communities have been consistently surprised that people can be successful with less than we would like to give them. And so that's the other data point really, is seeing what are the successes, even though someone might not have gotten what we thought they needed. If we do have success, that can help us inform referrals through the coordinated access going forward.
Right, and I think that piece about kind of returns to homelessness and the results, as you were saying, Suzanne, about where people were sent, that's really important. And it really, I think, can come back to those hard outcomes about new entries, length of stay, how long, once someone entered a program, how long were they in it until they were successfully housed? Were they successfully housed, and if they're coming back? And I think starting with kind of those basic outcomes and the information that Matt was mentioning is kind of gathering information on the need and the referral made based on that need can just be extremely helpful in terms of figuring out not just the gaps in the system, but also, are we, which groups specifically, kind of drilling down, which groups are we having the least success placing, which groups seem to be coming back the most, why might that be happening, and that can just be very illuminating just in terms of governing the system and figuring out what's needed, and also for funders kind of outside of maybe the main funders in the system, bringing that information back to programs and their funders and saying, we're having a really hard time serving this population or that population, and having people use that information to make decisions about their own individual programs as well.
And just one other thing that I want to jump in and add with this particular topic. In one particular community, we also looked at the length of time, or the length of the duration that it takes from the point at which the client gets assessed to when they get a referral to when they actually move into that referral, and tracking the length of stay at those different trigger points, or those different events, was really informative. And when there was sort of this backlog, we understood it to be a capacity issue, that there weren't enough beds for a particular program type. And when we drilled a little bit deeper, we realized it wasn't really a capacity issue at all. It was a coordination issue. And the managing the communication and the handoff and the linkage of the client from the referral source to or from the referral entity to the referral source was where things were breaking down. So tracking that length of stay can also help you identify how efficient or effective your coordinated assessment process is as well.
That's a great point. Okay, I'm going to go ahead. I want to make sure that we have enough time for people's questions. So I'm going to just take a few minutes, or a few seconds rather, to kind of scan through the questions people have asked so far and pick them out. If you haven't already submitted your question, again, you can put it in this questions or chat box that's at the bottom of your webinar screen. Let's see. Okay, so we do have one question about funding, which I think can be a very tricky question that I'll go ahead and throw out there, which is what funding sources are used or can be used for coordinated assessment, and have you all heard of anyone using their ESG funds for coordinated assessment?
I can start with this one. there are a lot of funding sources relatively, but each one has different considerations, and so have to be very intentional about pursuing these. A continuum could use their planning funds, their continuum of care planning funds. That's a potential source. You could have a designated grant within the continuum, one of the continuum components, and there's more guidance that's going to come out from HUD on exactly how to do that. But you could use a continuum of care grant to fund it, and you can use ESG. The thing to remember with all of these sources, and again, I think we need more HUD guidance in order to make informed decisions about this. Anytime you're using a HUD source, whether it's planning funds, continuum of care, program grant, or ESG grant, by nature of assessing a client with a program that's funded by that source, the client that's being assessed becomes a participant in the program, and that may trigger all kinds of participation requirements, collecting and entering data into HMIS, reporting on that activity. And I think there are lots of questions about what the requirements are around managing program participants that are, when you're using continuum of care funds or ESG funds. And we probably need a little bit more guidance from HUD before I would recommend which route to go for communities. But the bottom line on top, the answer is yes. ESG and continuum of care funds could be used to support coordinated assessment.
Right, and I think for continuum of care, it's planning dollars, if I'm not mistaken, and for ESG, I believe it's under the outreach and emergency shelter activities. I think it's the case management. I'll double check that, but I believe those are the eligible funding sources for each of those groups. And I'll say we've talked to a lot of communities about coordinated assessment, and I haven't heard anyone that kind of has just one funding source unless they have a local government that has a lot of money. So I think it's really kind of patching together private, public, HUD funding, not HUD funding, and kind of putting that all together in one pot to get things like this, get them implemented and get them going.
I think that,
no, go ahead, Suzanne.
Yeah, I just want to, because I think, in terms of, it depends a little bit on how your system is designed, because certainly if it is a HUD-funded program and if the assessments are done at the program level, assessment is an activity. Assessment is an eligible activity for staff to be completing assessments, and it's actually a requirement to do annual reassessments of service needs. So one thing may depend a little bit on how you're building out your coordinated assessment. I think the other, we really needed in a lot of communities to bring some private funders to the table, because the build-outs on the data system, I think as Matt mentioned, tracking both the outcomes as well as these process indicators, like how long does it take to get from A to B to C, has been really illuminating. And I've rarely seen a coordinated access started that didn't require at least some build-out on the HMAS. And that's been something people have been successful in getting some private funders, because it is usually one time or 1 year kind of a grant to do the initial build-out of that, and that's been a way to engage the private funding community in the process. But certainly, I think communities have really looked to also state and local resources, and I know, because I see how many people are on this phone call, that some of you don't have those resources, but certainly in the communities where government is involved, seeing if some state or local resources could be directed towards this, it may be necessary to make it work, all the way.
Thank you, guys. And we have a really great question about integrating domestic violence providers within the COC, but I know a lot of communities are trying to figure out how to confront this challenge, where there may be some coordination challenges there, maybe around, for example, data control requirements. What have you seen communities doing that are trying to kind of work with their domestic violence providers to integrate them with this larger process in a way that kind of protects what everybody needs to protect in terms of confidentiality, safety, et cetera?
Well, the first constraint I think that we need to clearly address is that if they're a victim service provider, they're not able to share information, and they're not able to participate in HMIS. In some communities, but that being said, It doesn't mean that they can't adopt the exact same assessment protocol, the same referral strategy, and they can't come up with other ways of sharing information with the proper protections and when appropriate to make sure that clients who are fleeing abuse or domestic violence get integrated into other existing continuum of care resources. So even though they can't participate necessarily as openly in HMIS and other kinds of information sharing arenas, it doesn't mean that they can't be an integral part of the continuum of care system. And in a couple of communities, I've experienced or I've seen where the DV, or the victim service provider, functions as the coordinated assessment entity. Because they have that information restriction, they step in, or they sort of, take on that responsibility on behalf of the rest of the community and perform that kind of assessment and referral function, and then they're able to manage it as an internal function. And I think that, it may work in some communities, it may not work in others, but I think that's an interesting model to consider.
I want to mention, oh, go ahead, Suzanne.
I think what the other thing about the domestic violence community in a lot of places that we've been doing work is that they already have a coordinated assessment process in many among the DV providers. So linking that process into coordinated access and making sure that there's the flow of information and communication between those two systems has been really helpful, and in fact has been a relief, because if someone is presenting with a domestic violence issue, if the DV providers are coordinated, that can be a very easy link if someone presents with those issues. I think on a sort of just a purely practical level, what we've done because of the HMIS rule that Matt cited is use a paper referral process, and you can transmit paper electronically, but not entering the data in the HMIS so that they can in fact participate. They're using the same assessment information, at least the minimum data that's being collected. They're just not entering it into the HMIS, and then the referral is not through the HMIS, but it's done on paper, whether that's as a PDF or a fax or something like that, as long as it's consistent with the local confidentiality, so that they are still really a part of that process. And then in terms of maintaining some of those folks on wait lists, if they're not in the HMIS, they're using a code that the DV provider knows, the client ID code, but the client's name is not actually added to the list, but the DV provider that's serving them is, so that when that person comes up on the wait list or comes up next for the referral, the DV provider is contacted and then they reach out to the client. So these are all a little bit workarounds, but it has been, I think, there are lots of ways to bring that population and sector into these processes.
That's great, and I think that's one of the most important things, is just to start the conversation right away with, I think, domestic violence providers, and to talk about, how these issues can be dealt with, if any infrastructure exists already that is kind of a coordinated assessment for domestic violence providers. And I do want to mention, we'll be kind of putting out more materials on this. We also have on our website a coordinated assessment, domestic violence toolkit, or kind of checklist for people as they're planning their process, what to think about to best serve domestic violence survivors. And we have a conference presentation also in the Coordinated Assessment Toolkit about providers kind of talking about how this process has worked in their community. And we're just out of time. I want to go ahead and ask just one more question, since we had a few come in, and that's about kind of coordinating at a higher level. So for people that aren't working in a city or a county, but maybe working with an entire balance of state or even statewide continuum on coordinated assessment, what are your tips there in terms of how to make this work?
I think they're the same approaches in terms of the same type of stakeholders, the same kind of measures, the same engagement process. It's just as much more complicated, and it's probably on a larger scale. Just this week I was having conversations where there's a particular community that's right on the border between two different states, and the community really functions as one large continuum, even though it crosses state boundaries. And they wanted to do one single coordinated assessment that integrated protocols and practices and HMIS from 2 different states. And we went through the list of kind of planning tasks, and it was the exact same list that any community would approach. It just is a bit more complicated and cumbersome. There's more players, lots more coordination, and it will probably take a little bit longer, but it's the same essential group of people in the same steps.
And think, I think all those points that Matt made are really important and really good points. And some of the bigger areas that we've been working in, they have to take a look at, and say in a balance of state that's pretty large, what are the natural service areas? And that may kind of related to what he was talking about across a bridge of states, but the continuum of care may or may not be a natural service area. In other words, the way that people access services, there may be people who cross continuums or go from, or maybe they don't. Maybe the people, because of the way the geography is in the community, they really do stay within one area to get services. But taking a look at how people flow through the different geographies that are involved, whether they do or don't, having maybe similar processes in those different geographies, so that if a client does cross the geography, they're really going through a similar process. But I think we have to maybe look sometimes at whether what our geography has been for planning is in fact really a natural.
Suzanne?
Oh,
I think Suzanne got off.
Oh, maybe we lost Suzanne.
But I think we got most of her answer there. So, and I think I would agree that it is really when you're looking at that larger scale. I think in terms of the modeling of it, you may be looking at. I know a lot of places do kind of a 2-1-1 screen, and then kind of refer people, as Suzanne was saying, kind of based on geography to different places. But I think a lot of the concepts in terms of what we talked about today remain similar, kind of similar issues and similar solutions.
Exactly.
Sorry, I hit the mute button. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. Well, I want to thank Suzanne and Matt for joining us today, and thank everyone for listening in. As promised, I will send out these slides, and when it's posted, the recording of this as well as directions on how to reach our coordinated assessment toolkit and some other relevant resources. Hopefully that was helpful to everybody today. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.